DiscerningHearts.com presents Inside the Pages, insights from today's most compelling authors. I'm your host, Kris McGregor, and I'm delighted to be joined by Sister Regina Vandenberg, who is a member of the Sisters of St. Francis of the Martyr St. George. She obtained her PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America. She has served in various apostolates for her religious community and currently resides in Rome. With Sister Regina Vandenberg, we go inside the pages of Communion with Christ, according to Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, published by Ignatius Press. Sister Regina, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I absolutely love Communion with Christ, especially according to Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. It is such a special book. Thank you so much for writing it.
I'm glad I had the opportunity to do so. Yes, and to make her known a little bit better.
Well, first, tell us a little bit about yourself. And why you became interested in this incredible saint.
I am a religious sister. I've been in the convent for 22 years. I belong to a community in the Midwest, the Sisters of St. Francis of the Martyr St. George. And I became interested in Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross actually right at the beginning of my religious life. When we take the habit, we receive a new name. And the sister who was responsible for us postulants thought I should take the name Editha. And so she had me read a lot. She encouraged me to read a lot of Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross's works, and so I did, and became very interested in her. And so later in the convent, when I had opportunity to study, I studied a lot of her works in the context of philosophy. And the more I read of her, and the more I came to know, the more I just love her as a saint who has, in a sense, become a real friend to me and helped to draw me closer to Christ and to His Church. And so that's how I came to know Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross.
Her life is an extraordinary story, one that, can we say it's such a compelling one, particularly in the context of the 20th century?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I suppose before growing up, she grew up in a Jewish family, but stopped practicing the faith when she was a young teenager. Not because she was rebellious or so, but because she was seeking the truth, and she didn't find it in her faith, in the Jewish faith. And she became then, I suppose, not unlike many young people today, to searching for the truth. She really searched everywhere and became also very involved in the feminine movement, which at the time was really working for women to be able to vote and to do things like attend the university, which was at her time still rather unusual. She was one of the first women to actually study at the university, and when she finished her studies, she was unable, even though she had her PhD, to teach at a university because it was simply unheard of for a woman to take such a position. But in the course of her studies, and not even so much through her studies, but more through the witness of people, she received glimmers of light into the truth of the faith. One which always touches me very much is when she went to visit a cathedral as a tourist to see its artistic value, and saw a woman looked like just a housewife coming in with her groceries, with a basket of groceries, into the cathedral, kneeling there quietly for a few moments and then leaving. And she said it was as though she was there having a personal conversation with someone, which of course she was. But for Edith Stein, that was something she had never experienced, that God was someone personal. And so events like that really had an impact on her, and eventually led her to convert to the faith.
What's so beautiful about this book, Sister Regina, is that it is not, yes, we find out events and different experiences that Edith Stein, before she becomes Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, we learn a lot about her life. But what's extraordinary about the book is that it's more about how we can learn from her to go deeper in our union with Christ. It's not, like I said, it's not just a biography of a saint, but it's a way that we can go deeper, and we need that so much today, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that was my impetus a little bit in writing, that the title is Communion with Christ, and communion is that really every person longs for communion, to be known, to be loved, and to know and love, and to be in harmony with others, with God. And I'm convinced that Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross can show us a way to that communion, and that's how the saints are relevant, not only because they have beautiful stories which have their own value, but because they can help us in our own lives and on our own road to communion with Christ and with His Church. So, yes, yeah.
There was another saint that she would, just through her teachings and her life, would touch so deeply, and he would end up touching the world in extraordinary ways. And of course, I'm speaking of Saint Pope John Paul II.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. In a certain sense, they're very similar. I think in the sense that they're both around the same times, and he canonized her, he beatified her. But also they come from the similar background philosophically in their studies, and have that approach of the focus on the person, the individual person, and the person's vocation, and really high vocation to union with the Blessed Trinity, which has always been taught. But their emphasis on the person is something that is kind of a new touch, so to speak. Mm-hmm.
I think that that whole aspect of communion with Christ, I think there's an element of it that sometimes we miss in our contemporary trying of a catechesis. We fail to mention that if you're going to be in communion with Christ, you are going to have to embrace the cross. And that's the hardest part, isn't it, Sister, that for many, especially in the spiritual life and in that growth, to pass through that fire of the suffering.
It is. But it's the most difficult, but in a certain sense it's also the most consoling, because everyone has to suffer in life and does suffer in life, mm-hmm. Whether we are believers or not. But with the faith, there is a meaning. And the suffering takes on a different quality, where we can suffer with someone and we can suffer for someone. And so in that light, it kind of takes on, there's a beauty to it that it lacks if we don't have the faith. Then it is only the raw reality of pain. So, but it is the most difficult part to embrace. This is true. This is very true.
Well, and in many cases we can, it's sometimes easier, this is going to sound very strange how I'm phrasing this, but it's sometimes easier for us to endure our suffering than to assist our brothers and sisters in the faith who are struggling as well. And I thought one of the most compelling parts of the book, and the entire work is just tremendous, but one of the most compelling parts for me was that whole teaching on empathy. And I just think that is essential if we're ever going to understand communion with Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The beautiful gift that we human beings have to infeel someone else, and it's so that even those whose experiences are vastly different, that we can feel what they feel in a certain sense. Not to the full extent, but we have that capacity so that we are able to truly empathize with others. And then, of course, we take that into our life of prayer, that and so many of our devotions are really geared to help us to do this. The meditation in the rosary on the various mysteries or the Stations of the Cross, to try to infeel what our Lord felt or what the Blessed Mother felt. And it's not imagining what they feel, but truly to infeel. And And Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross writes a great deal about that. And it also is, of course, what helps us in our communion with one another. It helps us understand one another. We can, and it's a very natural gift. When we see someone in pain, we can kind of read the pain in the face. Even outside, we do it through the externals, through the maybe contorted face or the tears, but we penetrate through them, and we're able to tell that someone is in deep pain, and so we can empathize. So it's a beautiful gift we have.
That way of describing it, the in-feeling, you're feeling within the person. And that's really, for the Catholic, it should not be a foreign concept, especially when we go to Mass all the time, through him, with him, and in him. And then that becomes more, it becomes more fully alive, because it's not I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. That whole area to understand that it's going in deeper. And we live in a time of boundaries, don't we, sister, where everybody says, well, I need to have boundaries here and boundaries there. And while that may be good in some ways, that is a real danger to entering into someone's experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because we can also close ourselves right, to others, to close to not allow others in, and then we become very isolated.
Well, and understanding ourselves is something that Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross had written extensively about, it, understanding who we were created to be, both male and female. Am I correct in that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. This was particularly after she converted and had been teaching already for a good 8 years. She gave many lectures, especially to groups of women. She said, before my conversion, I was a strong feminist, and at the time, as I mentioned, she was interested in the woman's vote and the right to have a career and such things. And she said, now I speak about it not because I'm a feminist, but because I feel compelled. And she spoke in a whole different vein than of the beauty of being a woman and what it means to be a woman. She spoke especially about women, some also about men, but most of her audience tended to be women. So she spoke about them, the role of woman and the place and what we're called to be. And that is so important today, especially with all the confusion that reigns in the secular world about gender and who we are and who we're, who God created us to be. So, and really we can't be at peace with others unless we're at peace with who God made us to be as man or as woman.
Boy, it does come down to identity, doesn't it? And knowing who we are and who, and as you said, who we are created to be. Yeah,
that it's not something we decide.
Well, and not something we decide is another aspect of the book. I mean, it is divided into such incredible sections: communion with Christ and His cross, communion with our brothers and sisters, communion between man and woman, and communion with God's will. Now that right there, it's not my will, but His will be done. And that's some of the greatest suffering we may or may not realize we even go through, is surrendering that will of ours.
Yeah, that's the hardest part. And I think in that, Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross is such an example. She shows herself so, when she converts, it was not only a mental assent, it was her whole person, because she was a very strong person. And in the book I gave some examples also of before her conversion, for example, when she was working with her professor, Husserl, and she said that I can work with someone, but I can't be subservient, I can't be obedient, and if he does not accept that, then I will quit. And she quit because he wanted her to do what he told her. So she had a very strong will, and she wasn't going to be led by another. But once she converted, it changed completely. She knew she wanted to do God's will and not her own. And knowing how strong her own will was, she was very careful to do not her will but God's will. So she wanted, for example, to enter Carmel right after her conversion, but her spiritual director always told her no. So for 10 years she waited. And after 10 years, her spiritual director gave her the okay, and she entered. And even then, I could go on, but entering Carmel when she was over 40, and she was really an accomplished woman, and then to enter as, together with young women, 18 years old, and she was, all the reports about how she was in Carmel, she was so humble, they had no idea of who she really had been in the world. They didn't know. And how she obeyed, even when they, for example, corrected her Latin when she was actually right and they were wrong, and she obeyed. Just all those little things show how much she had really given over her will to our Lord.
And giving over her will, and just again, in that incredible act of heroic virtue in remaining in Holland when the Nazis knowingly are coming for her. The prudent action, a normal prudent action, would be to have accepted the tickets to leave and go to South America, and yet a supernatural type of prudence and a heroic virtue in obeying the Father's will and staying and in accepting that cross. I mean, wow, that had to have been communion, because that mirrors so much the one she loves. That mirrored Christ so extraordinarily.
And I have to say, with her on that, because on that day that she was arrested, there were also arrested many other Jewish converts to the faith, and I have had the occasion to read a number of their biographies, and it is most edifying and inspiring to read them, because the majority of them were ready to suffer. They were ready to suffer for the church. They were ready to suffer the death and the concentration camps, which all of them, some of them survived, but all of them were sent to first concentration camps in the Netherlands, and then most of them off to Germany. But yes, and Edith Stein, of course, and her sister Rosa were among them as witnesses, and they were going for the church because they were arrested because the church had spoken up, and so they knew it was for the sake of the church that they were suffering.
So many of us, I think, would say, oh, I don't think I could do that. I don't think I have that in me. It would be too frightening. And yet, again, it goes back to communion, doesn't it? Because it's not I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. And if you have communion, it won't be you. It will be Him working through you, won't it?
It will be. Yes, we have to have full confidence in that, because I think any of us, when we're honest, would say, well, I don't know how I would respond. I know I would wish to, but would I have the strength? But in the moment, we have to trust that there will be the grace, and in union with Him, like you say, we will be able to do His will.
And that's why it's so essential, because who knows, we may not be asked to make the type of choices that she made at the end of her life and embrace that cross of martyrdom, but yet we may, like another little Carmelite and a little flower who was called to embrace all the little things. It's the little ways, the little sufferings. That can be something that is paramount as well, isn't it?
It is, and that is something we all surely encounter. And in a certain sense, those small things are sometimes even harder, in the sense that for the larger events, we kind of pull ourselves together, but the small things catch us off guard, and sometimes they can be just as hard, the many repeated small difficulties. Even when we think of the little flower, and just the way that another sister rattled her rosary, and all those small sufferings can have infinite value if we use them, and if we live in communion with Him.
Sister Regina, the School of Communion. Talk to us about that, because I think we need it so desperately today.
Yes, in her Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross had quite some occasion to talk about education, because she was also a teacher for most of those years, and for her, she speaks of education in terms always of communion, that it's not the main goal of education is not to prepare us for a job or to make us competitive in the world, but to prepare us to live in society in the place that God would have us. And so her vision of a community of a classroom, for example, would be that those who are in a classroom together under the guidance of the teacher, who's kind of the head of the community, learn to give and take. They learn through interaction in the classroom what are each one's strengths and weaknesses. And for example, one child may be a good mathematician, so he may be able to help some other student who's not so good in that area, but then that student may be good in art and can help the teacher to make drawings on the board. And in that way, in that kind of give and take, what develops in the children is, well, first they come to know themselves and what their strengths and weaknesses are, and also they experience that my weaknesses can be met by someone else who has that strength, and my strengths can help others, instead of this competitive environment which can often dominate in education, that you simply want to get ahead of the others, or that the whole point of education is to get good grades so you can go to a good school and have a well-paying job. That's not where joy lies, nor not for the students either. But to create this kind of communion. And of course she talks also about how that begins in the family. That she has a very interesting kind of longer essay about the role of the mother, in which she begins even with when a mother is pregnant with a child, and how even those months are so formative for the child in the womb. And she begins that lecture in a funny way, saying that, she's speaking to all mothers. The mothers may think, well, who is she to speak to us of motherhood when she's single at the time? Mm-hmm. And she said, I feel that I'm qualified to speak to you because I grew up in a family, because I have seen many families, and so in that sense I feel like I have something to share with you. But how each the stage of the child's life is so formative, and the importance of the parents in the child's life. And that is very compelling, what she said about those early years of the child.
Well, it is that, as you help us to recall in her writings, that the difference between community and association, that what it is, because words matter when we use them, and sometimes we forget their meanings. So when we talk about what it is to be a community out of communion, or are we really, or have we become an association? And that's very different, isn't it?
Yes. An association is a group of people who gather together for a goal, and it can be a very good, a noble goal. So it may be, even she mentions examples like a soccer team. So why are the people coming together? To play soccer? Or it can be even in a workplace, that you come to the reason that people, for example, in a factory, work together and are together is in order to produce a product, and that's important. But that alone is not sufficient. The other experience would be community, in which people don't bind themselves together for a particular finite goal, but for the sake of the other. And so there's no particular product that comes out of the community. And this would be, the prototype would be, for example, a friendship. I'm not a friend with someone in order to get something out of it, or marriage, or a family. That the goal of being together is simply that, to be together. And of course these interplay, so that sometimes in a community there are associations. For example, in my own life, living in a religious community, that would be a community where we don't have, our reason for being together is to collectively and individually give ourselves wholly to Christ. But then there are also associative aspects. For example, as a community, we may take on some project. I don't know, it could be even in the small community, we could put on a play or something, or and then we each have our function in that. And so that would be an association within the community. And that's normal, and that's good. Just as long as there's never an association without a community, because then the focus really isn't on the person. The person becomes something that can easily be substituted as long as someone else can do your function. As is the case in a factory or whatever, that if someone quits, you find someone else to do the job. But in a community, it's not like that. If a member of the family leaves, it's not that you can just substitute some other person to do the same thing. So that shows the difference between the two realities.
Well, and that's at its heart. It's imperative to understand that, because to be the mystical body of Christ is to be a community, a communion. So you can't say, if I chop off the hand, the body's going to live. No, the community collapses. That's why you have to nourish the entire body. Mm-hmm. It's all vital. And that is, for Edith Stein, for Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, it's such an important paradigm, isn't it?
It is, yes. And as you mentioned, the mystical body of Christ is kind of the community that she speaks of, especially. And also she speaks of that of course includes heaven and earth, and that is the community, and that's where we're headed, right? To the our life in the mystical body is only beginning here, and it continues in the life to come. Whereas the associative parts will fall away, because there will be nothing else but simply living in communion.
And that's why communion with Christ, according to Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, is not, I go back again, it's not a biography book as much. It's the lived experience of prayer that she is sharing through your efforts to all of us, to help us deepen in our ultimate relationship that comes through prayer. And I just wish we had more time, Sister Regina, but in closing our conversation, any final thoughts?
Well, my thoughts would be that for anyone who does have the occasion to read the book or to come to know Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, my prayer for you is that it will draw you deeper into communion with Christ and with His Blessed Mother and with the Church.
Would you say, just as a quick side note, Sister Regina, that there are many people who may do a lot of study of the work of Edith Stein, that ultimately, though, this was her end goal, was this understanding of communion with Christ? Yes.
She said, in everything I do, my one goal is to teach people to live at the hand of God.
Beautiful. Mm-hmm. Sister Regina Vandenberg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and God bless you.
With Sister Regina Vandenberg, we've gone inside the pages of Communion with Christ, according to Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. To learn more about this book or to obtain a copy, go to ignatius.com, the website for its publisher, Ignatius Press, or you can find it at any fine Catholic bookstore. To hear and or to download this discussion, along with many others, go to discerninghearts.com. This has been a production of discerninghearts.com. I'm your host, Kris McGregor. Join me next time for Inside the Pages, insights from today's most compelling authors.